In this video, we will be inspecting and replacing the bearings, chain, and agitator on the Brinly Aerator spreader model AS2-40BH-G or AS2-40BH P. If the chain has come loose on your aerator spreader, this may be a symptom of a different problem. So first, you should check to see if any other parts need to be replaced. Parts for the AS2-40BH are available in the Brinly parts store at shop.brinly.com. Please note, similar parts are also available for the previous generation of Brinly Aerator spreaders, the AS2-40BH, including the Agitator Kit, which we will be installing in this video. Removing the chain shield. Using a 7/16" wrench and socket wrench, remove the 1/4 inch lock nut and the 1/4 inch by 1/2 inch hex bolts that hold on the chain shield. Then, using extreme caution, place a 7/16" wrench on the lock nut near the tines, and use the 7/16" socket wrench to twist the bolt on the outside of the piece. Use extreme caution when holding your hands near the aerator spikes. Repeat this step for the second bolt, holding the nut in place with the wrench and using the socket wrench on the outside of the piece to twist the bolt free. Then, remove the chain shield and check to see if the chain is still on the sprockets or if it is hanging loose. If the chain is not on both sprockets, check the sprockets on the end of the tine shaft assembly and the agitator shaft assembly to see if there is any wear and tear. Removing the upper lever. While removing and inspecting parts, you will need to turn the piece upside down to rest on its hopper. This is easiest if you remove the upper lever. Using 2 1/2 inch wrenches, remove the nut from the end of the bolt and set the upper lever aside. Using extreme caution, place the piece upside down to rest on its hopper. Removing the chain. If the chain is still on both sprockets, it will need to be removed. To remove the chain, you will need to locate the quick release link. This link can be taken apart by sliding off the outside spring clip, removing the inside plate, and separating the outside plate with the 2 pins from the end links on the chain. Keep all of these pieces safely aside for reattaching the chain during reassembly. Disassembling the tine shaft. To fully check the bearings, you will need to disassemble the tine shaft. Note, be sure to wear gloves and use extreme caution when moving your hands near the tines. The tine ends can be very sharp. Using a flathead screwdriver, pry off the 1 inch E-ring from the other end of the tine shaft, and remove the 5/8 inch thin flat washer. Then, using a pair of pliers, very carefully straighten out the 1.5 inch cotter pins that drive the tines, and pull them all the way out of the tine shaft. Using extreme caution, begin to pull the axle out, making sure to catch the thin washers at the end of the tine shaft. Then continue to pull the sprocket side of the axle out slowly and carefully remove the tine stars and bearings and set them aside. As you continue to slide out the axle, make sure to catch the thin washers next to the middle support. Continue to use extreme caution while holding the axle. Slide off the tine and bearing sandwiches and carefully set them aside. Note, the bearings do not snap together, so they may easily come apart from the tine star. Remove the remaining inside thin washers and slide the axle all of the way out. Note, there is one more washer on the axle behind the sprocket end, and it can stay there for now. If any of the teeth on the axle sprocket are damaged or broken, you will need to replace this entire tine shaft assembly. Inspecting the bearings. Using a flathead screwdriver, remove the 1 inch E-ring at the end of the bearing. Wiggle the bearing to see if the bearing has been worn down. If this bearing has worn down along the inside edge of the square, this wiggle room can be enough to cause the chain to slip off of the sprocket teeth. If the bearing is able to move around at all in the square hole, you will need to replace the square bearing. A new or undamaged bearing will not have any give in the square hole as shown. Reassembling the tine shaft. Place the new or undamaged square bearing back onto the side plate and snap on the 1-inch E-ring. If you have a new Tine shaft assembly or have removed the first washer, be sure to re-add the first thin washer onto the end of the axle. Then slide the axle back through the square bearing. Using extreme caution, add the bearings and tines back onto the axle. If the bearing and tine sandwiches have come apart, then slide a bearing onto the axle with the flat face inward, followed by a tine star, placing the nibs of the bearing into the holes of the star. Then, slide the second bearing onto the axle, also lining up the nibs with the holes in the star. This will secure the star in place, although the bearings will not snap into place. Repeat this step for the first 7 tine and bearing sandwiches, very carefully sliding them onto the end of the axle. Then replace the 3 washers on the end of the axle next to the middle support, and pass the axle through the square bearing in the middle support. Very carefully place the remaining 4 tine and bearing sandwiches onto the end of the axle. In order to get the final bearing on, you will have to push the axle back to be able to slide the bearing sandwich in place. Then push the axle in from the sprocket end to place the bearing onto the axle. When the axle is at the very end of the bearing, place the flat washers between the bearing and the side plate to eliminate any wiggle room. This should be a tight fit. Then slide the axle through the washers and the square bearing on the side plate. Make sure the axle is pushed all the way in to allow the washer and E-ring to be snapped back on. If there is no room for the E-ring, you may need to remove one of the last washers you placed on the axle. After placing the E-ring back onto the end of the axle, spin the axle so the cotter pin hole in both the bearing and the axle line up as shown. Insert either a new or straightened cotter pin into the hole, using extreme caution when moving your hands around the tines. Then rotate the second bearing so the cotter pin holes also align and insert the second new or straightened cotter pin. Using pliers, bend the ends of the cotter pins in place. These pins will drive the spikes on the axle. Disassembling the agitator shaft. Next, we will disassemble the agitator shaft in order to replace a dented or bent agitator blade. If you have a damaged agitator blade, you can purchase a new Agitator Kit in the Brinly parts store. Note, the Agitator Kit only comes with 1 agitator blade and 2 sets of nuts and bolts. If you are replacing both agitator blades, you will need to purchase 2 Agitator Kits. With the chain unattached, remove the E-ring and washer from the end of the agitator shaft. Then, using a 1/4-inch drill bit, drill out the rivets that pass through the agitator blades and shaft. If the rivet remains in the axle after the agitator is removed, tapping the rivet with a hammer and screwdriver or using a pair of pliers to remove the rivet may be necessary. If both agitator plates are worn or damaged, you will also need to remove and replace the second agitator by drilling out the rivets using a 1/4-inch drill bit, tapping them out with a screwdriver and hammer, and/or pulling the rivet out with pliers if necessary. Then, from the sprocket side, pull the agitator axle out and check the sprocket teeth. The washers can stay on the end of the axle. If they are removed, they will need to be replaced. Then, check the small square bearing at the end of the axle for any wearing down. If this bearing has worn down along the inside edge of the square, you will need to replace the square bearing. Replacing the agitator shaft. First, replace the small square bearing, making sure the circular hole in the shutter assembly and the square hole in the side plate are aligned and the bearing has no wiggle room when inserted. If they aren't already, place the 2 washers back on the end of the agitator shaft and slide it back through the small square bearing in the side plate. Then pass it through the second small square bearing and side plate. Note, If the bearing comes out of the shutter assembly, make sure it is set back flush with the edge of the shutter assembly. Also be sure the axle is pushed in far enough for the washer and E-ring to fit on the end of the axle. When replacing the agitator blade, notice that the large hole in one end of the blade should be oriented on the outside edge of the hopper. Place the groove in the agitator blade around the axle and align the holes in the blade and the axle. Then, insert two number 10 bolts through both holes and secure in place with a number 10 lock nut by using a screwdriver and an 1/8" wrench. The agitator blade should spin freely with the axle. Repeat these steps with the second agitator blade if needed. Notice that the large hole in one end should be positioned on the outside edge of the hopper. Place the groove in the agitator blade around the axle and align the holes in the blade and axle. Then insert two number 10 bolts through the holes and secure them in place with a number 10 lock nut by using a screwdriver and 1/8" wrench. The agitator blades should now both spin freely with the axle. If the chain hasn't been separated, first, locate the quick release link in the chain. This link can be taken apart by sliding off the outside spring clip, removing the inside plate, and separating the outside plate with the two pins from the end links on the chain. Using extreme caution, flip the piece upside down to the hopper to have better access to the chain and sprockets. With the chain open, wrap the chain around both sprockets and make sure the quick release linkage is located in the gap between the side plate and the shutter assembly as shown. Insert the ends with the two pins into the linkage to connect the chain and add the inside side plate. Then slide on the outside spring clip using a flathead screwdriver. Using extreme caution, spin the Tine stars. The spikes should now drive the chain and agitator axle. Replacing the chain shield. To place the chain shield back in place, align the holes in the chain shield and side plate. Then slide the first 1/4" by 1/2" hex bolt through the chain shield and side plate. And using extreme caution to avoid injury on the tines, place the 1/4" lock nut onto the end of the hex bolt. Then slide the second 1/4" by 1/2" bolt through the chain shield and side plate, and using extreme caution to avoid injury on the tines, place the second 1/4" lock nut onto the end of the hex bolt. Then very carefully hold the nut in place using a 7/16 wrench, keeping your hand located near the tines stable, and from the outside of the chain shield, spin the bolt using a 7/16" socket wrench to secure them in place. Replacing the upper lever. Be sure to reinstall the upper lever. Slide the 5/16" by 3/4" hex bolt through the holes in the upper and lower levers and add the 5/16" lock nut, securing the lever in place using two 1/2" wrenches. Your Brinly Aerator spreader should now be restored and reassembled. For any questions, contact Brinly Customer Service at 877-728-8224. Brinly, since 1839.